Hello, everyone, and welcome. On behalf of the National Eczema Association, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on the topic of complementary and alternative medicine for eczema. I'm Carrie Gauthier, Associate Director of Marketing and Communications. We see that people are still logging on and want to give them a few moments to join us. While we're waiting, I want to make sure you know about all the upcoming activities here at NIA. October is Eczema Awareness Month. Join us for a month-long journey to be well, mind and body. As a part of that, registration is now open for the Itching for a Cure virtual walk, which raises funds and awareness. Coming up on October 1st is our final Leaders in Eczema one-day forum of 2017, and it will be held at Mount Sinai in New York on October 1st. We have two final webinars planned. That will include How to Be Well When You Don't Feel Well, the Brain-Body Connection with Jennifer Moyer-Dar, a licensed clinical social worker out of National Jewish Health in Denver. And then we will finish the year with Newly Diagnosed with Atopic Dermatitis, What You Need to Know with Dr. Adam Friedman. So it looks like we're about ready to start here. For those of you who have just joined us, welcome. I'm Carrie Gauthier, Associate Director of Marketing and Communications at the National Eczema Association. I'd like to welcome you to the National Eczema Association's webinar, Complementary and Alternative Medicine, Separating Fact from Fiction, with Dr. Peter Leo. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared with all attendees within a week. The National Eczema Association is a national, patient-oriented organization which is governed by a board of directors and guided by a scientific advisory committee comprised of physicians, nurses, and scientists who volunteer their time and expertise. We work to improve the health and quality of life for individuals with eczema through research, support, and education. Our presenter tonight is Dr. Peter Leo, who is a great supporter of the National Eczema Association, sitting on both our board of directors and our scientific advisory committee. He serves as Assistant Professor of Clinical Dermatology and Pediatrics at the Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine and is the founding director of the Chicago Integrative Eczema Center Medical Dermatology Associates of Chicago. Dr. Leo is a fellow of the American Academy of Dermatology and a diplomat of the American Board of Dermatology, board certified in dermatology. He received his medical degree and dermatology training from Harvard Medical School, where he served as chief resident in dermatology. While at Harvard, he received formal training in acupuncture as well. He has received a Leader of Distinction Award, a Presidential Citation from the American Academy of Dermatology, and numerous teaching awards. Dr. Leo will present for approximately 30 to 50 minutes. Please use the questions section to the right of your screen to send us questions throughout the presentation. Following the presentation, we will have a short 2 minutes for additional questions to be submitted. Dr. Leo will answer as many as possible after his presentation. Additional questions that we are unable to answer due to time will be answered as we are able in a follow-up question and answer write-up, and will be shared with all registrants. And with that, I am pleased to introduce our presenter, Dr. Peter Leo.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming and tuning in, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about one of my areas of focus and one of my areas of passion clinically, which is complementary and alternative medicine treatments. My only conflict of interest here is that I am a member of the American Academy of Medical Acupuncture, and that means that I, kind of like Fox Mulder from the X-Files, want to believe. I like alternatives. I'm interested in this area, and so it might be a little bit different than you're used to hearing from maybe some other healthcare practitioners who are not interested in this area. Sometimes there's some really hard skepticism about it. Next slide, please. And the next slide, please. So the first question that comes up a lot is, why are we even talking about alternative medicine? Don't we have all these great treatments? Don't we have everything figured out in conventional medicine? And I would say that the answer is a definitive no, we definitely do not. We have learned all sorts of important things about health and disease, and we know so much more about atopic dermatitis and eczema than we did before, but we still have a lot of unanswered questions. And I think people tend to be interested in alternative medicine when the disease we're talking about is not curable, when the explanations that we have are not satisfying, and when our treatments are often felt to be either unsafe or only symptomatic, that we're not getting to the root of the problem. And I feel the same way sometimes about some of the things we talk about. Next slide, please. We have learned so much about science and about the science of atopic dermatitis, but one of the problems is that there is a pretty big imbalance. We know so much of the basic science, and we can look at this representation. This is from Dr. Howell Williams in the UK, who kind of illustrates it beautifully by showing we know all of this about very specific parts. We know about the cytokines and Th1 and Th2 and about the ceramides and different proteins. But when you look at the other side of the tree, the big questions, the part where we really need to have the answers for clinic and treating patients, it's often pretty sparse. How common is it? What really causes it? Can it be prevented? We're just learning about those things. And so there is this imbalance between what we know, all this knowledge, and what we can actually practically use. Next slide, please. One thing we know is that people will not go towards alternative when we have Western medicines or conventional medicines that work well and work safely. And one of the ways that I think we can see this is that many patients, once they get their skin under really good control, they often stop worrying about things like food allergens that aren't directly food allergic, and diet and some of the alternatives. I have many patients who are interested in alternative medicine, and once they're better, they say, well, it didn't matter so much. I guess it wasn't what he was eating. I guess it didn't really matter. And that's interesting to me as a clinician, because some of these patients were very, very convinced that this was what was going on. And once things improve, it seemed like it wasn't. And so that's one of the things that I try to bring to this whole area is some experience, some longitudinal experience for each patient. Sometimes you kind of feel like you're the only person there, and you're sort of living it in the moment. So this is what we think, this is what feels like it, we don't know. But after you've seen a number of people year after year and you get a sense of the longitudinal part, it's interesting. That being said, many times I've had patients have success with alternatives as well. And so I don't want to undermine those, but it's just interesting to see that people often seek them when they're not getting better with conventional therapy. Next slide, please. One of the other things fueling this area is the idea of steroid phobia. Many patients are concerned about topical steroids. Many doctors and practitioners are worried about them too. They have a host of potential side effects. And I've had many patients over the years tell me that their doctor said, use this, here's 11 refills, and good luck. And that's it. And they just sort of told to keep using it. Well, we know that there are both real and perceived side effects to topical steroids, and this drives a lot of push towards alternative medicine. Many patients feel like every single doctor has pushed topical steroids on them, and they reach a breaking point where they say, look, this can't be the answer. This isn't helping us, and we need to do something different. I don't like the side effects. And many times the patients are right on. I think it's absolutely right. Next slide. But that's not the only thing people are afraid of. Of course, there are concerns about the topical calcineurin inhibitors. So that would be like Protopic and Elidel, tacrolimus and pimecrolimus. They have that black box warning. That's really scary. We know that antibiotics can have all sorts of side effects, and we're constantly being told, don't abuse antibiotics, don't overuse them. We know that preservatives are probably not great for us, especially when we're using tons of them in the form of products that we're putting on our body every day, such as parabens. And then I have some patients who are worried just about chemicals. They just say, I don't want all this synthetic chemical crap on my body, so or my child's body. So it's interesting to see the kind of range that we'll see of concerns. And I think these are all very valid reasons why people say, I want to try something different. Next slide, please. Sometimes I'll talk to my colleagues and they'll say, oh, well, maybe your patients come to you because they're interested in this, but my patients aren't interested in this. They're fine with topical steroids. They're fine doing conventional only. But I think that's not true. When you look at some of the studies that look at how many people are using alternative medicines, it's a huge number. It's probably at least 50% of patients with atopic dermatitis have tried one or more forms of alternative medicine. And some of the common ones are homeopathy, health foods, herbal remedies, dietary modification. These are things many, many, many people try, or at least are interested in. Next slide, please. And that brings us to the issue at hand, this concept of alternative medicine. And what is it? How do we define it? And I will argue that it is actually not easy to define. Many times when I'll talk about it, people will ask me very specific questions about a specific product or a specific herb. And a lot of times I won't know. I'll say, gosh, I've never heard of that. And they'll say, what? I thought you're an expert on this. Aren't you supposed to know a lot about this? And I'll say, well, part of the problem with alternative medicine is that it is gigantic. It's sort of a catch-all term for everything. It includes the grandma's chicken soup that helps you feel better to something you saw on the internet for only $19.99 that will 100% guarantee clear your eczema for life. It'll also help with gout and backache and headaches, all this silly stuff, snake oil type things, but it includes all of these things. And then it also includes the huge systems. So when we talk about traditional Chinese medicine, that's a gigantic system. It's complicated. It has a whole theory of health and disease. There's sub-schools within it. There's herbs, there's acupuncture, all these things. So to ask a question like, does it work? It's such a hard question. And of course, it even includes very simple things like a certain supplement or a vitamin. Next slide, please. One very functional definition that we can use is that alternative medicine basically includes the treatments that are not based on evidence. So in general, we try, and we definitely do not always succeed, but we try to use treatments in conventional medicine that have studies showing that they help. When we leave that domain, we enter the realm of alternative medicine. And this can be kind of two reasons. The first reason is that they just simply haven't been tested enough to know. We might have only a tiny bit of data or no data, and we just say, well, I don't know, it's not enough. And those are the ones I'm interested in, ones that have maybe some data that's promising but are not quite accepted yet. There's no doubt that there are a number of treatments that have been studied and found not to work. And they've sort of said, look, this is shown to be false. This is not going to help people. We shouldn't use it. And yet sometimes this is still used in alternative settings. So we try to avoid those. And I try to be aware of studies that show that something doesn't work, because that can be helpful too, to lead people away from something that I might say, look, I understand you don't want to use conventional treatments, but that particular alternative really doesn't seem to be helpful for people. Let's pick something else. Next slide, please. So we have all of these systems, we have non-systems, we have tons of anecdotal evidence, we have, just legions of people typing into the internet saying, hey, this helped me, this didn't help me, this was awesome, this caused problems. And that's really hard to sort through that, because sometimes the loudest voice gets the most attention, even if it's not representative of the truth. We've seen that, I think, in other domains now. The internet is a confusing place, and we can get trapped in sort of echo chambers where we're not seeing the whole picture. We also know that the problem is we don't have big drug companies funding these. People don't make a lot of money on a natural vitamin or an herb necessarily. There might be some companies that do, but if you're trying to look at a simple thing, many times there's not a lot of money to do a study. And it turns out studies cost a fortune. All these people, all these regulatory systems, you need all of these things to do it. So part of the issue is that we're never going to have the same quality studies as when a big drug company is behind it. And it's because, of course, they're going to invest tons of money that they're hoping to recoup. Next slide, please. So how do we think about this? Well, I can't cover all of alternative medicine tonight, although I wish I could, but I want to pick a couple of interesting things that we can think about. And so the filter that I'm using here is treatments that have some evidence, treatments that seem pretty safe, and treatments that are practical. Because sometimes, it'll be a very, very impractical thing where people have to go somewhere special. If it's going to France to spend 3 weeks at a spa, that would be great. I'll bet that will help. And that is sort of alternative. But for most people, that's not practical. And it certainly isn't practical long term. Even if you get much better with 3 weeks at the spa, next year, I don't know if you can go back, or next month, can you go back? Can you spend all of your time at the spa? Next slide, please. So we know so many of our patients really suffer, and part of the problem with this condition is that it is more than just skin deep. It's not just how it looks. People have itch, they have pain, they have sleep problems. We know that there are many behavioral issues associated with atopic dermatitis now. There's growth issues. Patients don't develop properly if their skin is miserable and infected and inflamed all the time. And so I often stress that it is so important to try to get this under control because the patients are suffering. And for our adult patients, they literally know it firsthand. For our parents of patients who are kids, they know it secondhand and very closely. They're often having sleepless nights along with their son or daughter. Next slide, please. Another patient of mine who really suffered a lot. Next slide, please. So one thing that is a disclaimer is the idea of 100% natural. Patients will often say to me, "Doctor, I want only natural products." And I just like to point out that it's a little tricky because we know that poison ivy is 100% natural. Arsenic, which is an element, what could be more natural than an element on the periodic table? It's not so good for us. And bacteria has been around a lot longer than we have, and it can cause trouble. So it's always a little dangerous to just assume nature equals safe. In fact, nature is kind of a rough teacher, right? If you're out in the wild, we know that there are things out there trying to eat you, things trying to hurt you, and we have to be a little careful. But I do think what we mean by it is that we want things that are a little bit closer to natural things rather than things that are so far removed and so synthetic. Next slide, please. And the problem there is, again, where we have patients who say, "I want to have natural and I'm taking these supplements." And my question back sometimes is, "Hey, but wait a minute, is this really natural? I mean, I know it says it's natural on this label, but this might have been put together by some guy in New Jersey in his garage. And I don't know if this is really safe and natural." And part of the job of the FDA, of course, is to, imperfectly, no doubt, but to the best of their ability, to crack down on things that are making false claims, on things that aren't produced correctly or in a clean and appropriate environment. And it's interesting to see sometimes we'll have patients who say, I trust this brand. I trust them. And I say, wow, that's great. How could I win your trust like this brand who you don't know, who you've never met, who you maybe just heard about from a few people on the internet? It's kind of wonderful that you've been able to give your trust without knowing anything about them. And sometimes I'll say, well, I don't trust them. I don't know where this comes from. And I don't know if they really are who they say they are. And that's why the FDA is so good. And we know even with the FDA, bad stuff gets through. So it's this confusing piece here. How do I pick a safe supplement? How do I pick a safe product? And the answer is a lot of times, I don't know. So there's a little bit of a leap of faith. Next slide, please. Part of my favorite learnings from my teachings when I studied acupuncture was that the approach to treating people is actually very, very different. And if you've ever seen an alternative practitioner, you probably got a taste of this. And it's wonderful. I think in Western medicine, we often use these very harsh terms. We use these belligerent, bellicose words, like we're going to kill it, we're going to attack it, we're going to smash it, cut it out. It's very strong. It's this aggressive language. When you see an alternative practitioner, you often hear a very different set of language. Things like, we're going to balance, we're going to restore, strengthen, tonify. It's kind of wonderful. I mean, who doesn't want to be tonified? It sounds fabulous. And it's really, it's not just language though, it's really the approach, the thinking. And by studying acupuncture, that helped me think about disease and health in a different way. And I think it's so important to think not just about crushing and attacking, but to try to balance things. And I think we can do that with integrative medicine. We can use the best of both to really balance people in a better way. And that's sort of what I'm interested in. In the next slide, we summarize that atopic dermatitis is a terrible disease. It's incurable thus far. Hopefully we're going to have a cure at some point. The explanations we give are often kind of crummy. And we have a lot of good medicines and some newer ones that are fantastic, but many of them, if not all of them, have side effects, some more significant than others. Next slide, please. So let's get to some of my favorites. So when we ask about alternative treatments that may be helpful, I think sunflower seed oil is really interesting and it's compelling to me. We know that if you put sunflower seed oil on the skin, it actually increases the synthesis of ceramides, these fats that are really helpful for skin barrier. And it also is a pretty good emollient, a moisturizer, and helps the barrier get better. It also has anti-inflammatory effects, two pieces that are really helpful for this disease. Next slide, please. They've done a few studies on it, and one study actually looked at patients who have lichenification. That's that thickened skin, that kind of leathery, thick skin that comes from chronic rubbing. And they were able to show that patients who had the sunflower oil as part of their regimen had significantly less lichenification at day 7 and day 21. So it really seemed to be a measurable effect. And the sense here is that it probably helps with itch, because we know the lichenification comes from scratching or rubbing. So if you help with the itch, this may help. So I really like this. I think it's a gentle and safe oil so long as you're not allergic to it. And I think patients can actually improve when they're using sunflower seed oil as part of their regimen. Next slide, please. Another study did an interesting control, and they actually had adults with atopic dermatitis use sunflower seed oil on one arm and olive oil as a control on the other. And what they found was really interesting. They found that the olive oil decreased the skin barrier. It actually damaged it, and it increased what's called the TOOL, the transepidermal water loss. So it was actually bad for the skin, and it actually caused mild redness. Whereas the sunflower seed oil group did much better. Their skin was improved, the barrier was better, they had better hydration, and it didn't cause any redness. So I like this study, even though it's very, very small, and you could be skeptical and say, well, it's 19 patients, but it's actually pretty nice. It's a split body study. They have atopic dermatitis, and I think it's at least worth listening to because we don't have any better data. But it suggests that olive oil is probably not so great for our eczema patients, and that sunflower seed oil is probably okay or even pretty good. Next slide, please. Another study looked at preterm infants, these premature babies that were born in Bangladesh. And it seems kind of random to put this here, but it's there because these babies have a high risk for a blood infection, sepsis. And the thought is that it's because their skin is immature, their barrier is damaged, so bacteria can get in. What they did in this study was they had some of the babies put on 3 times a day sunflower seed oil. And they found that those who did that had reduced this blood infection, the sepsis, by 41% and decreased mortality, death, by 26%. In other words, sunflower seed oil saved lives. I love this study because it shows that it probably really does help the barrier in a measurable way, but it also shows that even in the most premature patients, with the thinnest skin, the highest risk for trouble, they did fine. There were no side effects from it. So I really like that as a piece of evidence that helps me feel good about it, even using it in babies. Next slide, please. Coconut oil is another one of my favorites. We know that in the 70s and 80s, they used to use different solvents to extract it. So the big one they would use is hexane, and that was probably not so good for us. There was probably residual hexane in there. So I think coconut oil got a bit of a bad rap. But now if we get virgin coconut oil, it's also known as extra virgin. There's actually not a specific way to put those on there. With olive oil, it's very regimented, but here it's not. It's also the same as saying cold pressed. So these are basically ones that use no solvents, which is now most of the ones you can get. It's really nice. It has about 8% unsaturated fatty acids, and it has a lot of these medium chain fatty acids. It's colorless, odorless, it's cosmetically elegant, it's very rarely an allergen. Next slide, please. And there was a couple of neat studies. One study looked at virgin coconut oil versus mineral oil in 117 patients with atopic dermatitis. And what they found is that the coconut oil did significantly better. It decreased this eczema severity score called the SCORAD. It actually helped their eczema almost twice as much. And that's kind of impressive that it worked so well compared to the mineral oil, which is really interesting. And mineral oil, we know, is a petroleum product. It's a very reasonable moisturizer and skin protectant. So this did better than not just nothing, but then actually something that has some effect for sure. Next slide, please. there was another study that really got me interested in this, and it's that we know staph bacteria on the skin is playing a role in atopic dermatitis. It is fueling the disease. And one of the problems is that we don't want to use antibiotics too much. We don't want to overuse them. But there was a study that showed topical coconut oil decreased staph bacteria on the skin by 95% in patients with atopic dermatitis when applied twice a day for 4 weeks. And this was compared to they used olive oil as their control, only a 50% decrease in olive oil control. So this suggests that there may be some antibacterial effect, but a really safe type, a really gentle type. And I love this idea. So I, again, have many of my patients using coconut oil. In addition, I don't think it's something that's going to cure your eczema or be the only thing you can use, but it's a really nice thing we can add on. So maybe right after the shower or the bath, we can put the coconut oil on and then the medicine and then the moisturizer to kind of seal it in. I've had really good luck with that. Next slide, please. Massage therapy sounds kind of crunchy, kind of granola, kind of out there, but it's pretty wonderful. And there was a study that looked at 20 children with atopic dermatitis who got massaged for 20 minutes a day versus a control group who got their regular care, their regular creams and moisturizers. And they found that at 1 month, the parents of the kids had lower anxiety levels themselves, and also the kids had lower anxiety levels. It helped both patients and their parents. There was also a significant improvement on all the clinical measurements: redness scaling, lichenification, excoriation, itch. It was amazing. So one of my favorite things to do is to say, why don't we try a little bit of daily massage therapy using an essential oil? So we could use our coconut or our sunflower or both. Sometimes a lot of people just mix a little bit of both because you get both benefits, and do just 10 or 20 minutes of massage. And it's fantastic, easy to do, and really, I think, helps everybody. Everybody gets better. Next slide, please. Now, acupuncture is near and dear to my heart, and one of the studies that got me very excited was this one. It was from 2005, and they looked at a group of patients who have a terrible kind of itch. It's called uremic pruritus, and these are people that have kidney failure. When your kidney is not working right, you get this crazy, crazy itch that will not stop, and it's probably because there's sort of metabolic breakdown products in the blood that are driving your skin nuts. And they tried everything failed. These patients were going crazy, not unlike our eczema patients, right? Who can be going crazy with that itch that will not stop. And they did some acupuncture 3 times a week for a month. And they compared it to a fake acupuncture point, a pretend one. And they looked at the scores of their itch. Next slide, please. And what they found is pretty astounding. It worked. It worked really well. They had significant improvement in their itch compared to that fake point, which really didn't show any improvement. So not only did it help, but it helped much better than a fake point. So it wasn't just a placebo effect. This tells us it wasn't just doing something. It really, really did something measurable by stimulating that point. And so next slide, please. We decided to do a similar version of this, same point, large intestine 11, which is pictured here. You see it on the arm, kind of the bend of the elbow. We did it with our eczema patients, 15 adults, and we had them apply this little acupressure bead because we didn't want to use needles. Needles are a little tricky. But the same kind of thing, we had them do it for 3 minutes, 3 times a week for 4 weeks. And in the next slide, you can see that it significantly helped. The patients that had the acupressure got significantly better than those who didn't. And this was enough to be a measurable, statistically significant effect. And we published the study. It was pretty exciting. And to this day, I still have some patients who tell me, Dr. Leo, I still massage that point whenever I'm feeling itchy. And what I love about this is that it's really gentle. It's really safe. It doesn't really have any side effects. And nobody's making any money. No one's trying to sell anything here. This is just something to get people better that they can do at home. It's kind of empowering. Next slide, please. Now, another interesting alternative is vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 seems to block nitric oxide synthase and may prevent flare-ups by doing so. There were a few different trials in the literature that showed that topical vitamin B12 really helped, not oral. Interestingly, oral doesn't seem to do this, but it may just be that you need to get enough of it at the skin level. So when you put it on topically, this seems to be better than placebo, and it seemed to help as quickly as 2 weeks. So I tried to find it, and there's no such product that I could find. So we had a friend of ours make it for us. Next slide, please. And the pharmacist put it together, and we call it Pink Magic. And it literally is just B12 powder, which is a crimson red mixed in a gentle moisturizer base. So it turns this pretty pink color, and it's super safe and super gentle, and does seem to help some patients. Not all, but definitely some patients really like it, and it can keep things from flaring up a little bit. Next slide, please. Now, some people feel that yeast plays a role in certain types of atopic dermatitis, and I agree. I think particularly people that have head and neck eczema, where their face and their scalp is involved, that's not everybody. It's sort of its own subtype, but those patients may have an overgrowth of yeast, and it's possible that dilute apple cider vinegar may help with this. It's kind of antimicrobial. It may lower the pH, the acidity of the skin, which is good. We want the skin more acidic. It likes to be more acidic, but there's not great data. We've been in the middle of a study for a long time trying to solve it, and it turns out that it's difficult to study. So I don't know if we're going to be able to get some good answers, but hopefully we'll have some answers in the next year. Next slide, please. Now, at the end of a visit, sometimes a patient, I'll make a plan for them. We'll go over everything. We'll talk about all sorts of stuff. And at the very last minute, they'll say, but wait, what about diet? Can we talk about diet? And it's really tough because there is a lot here potentially. And it's so complex that almost you need more than a visit to do it. Sometimes you need many, many weeks to figure out what's going on with the diet. Next slide, please. There is a tremendous amount of chatter about diet on the internet. Most of my families, I put many here, but I feel like it's most, feel that this is the root cause. But that being said, there's pretty good data. The studies show that if you exclude foods in unselected patients, meaning people, if you have a food allergy, a true food allergy, you cannot eat that food. And I think all my patients know that. If you have peanut allergy, they're not quote unquote cheating with peanuts, because they would blow up. Their lips would blow up. They'd start puking. They'd feel terrible. They could die. If you truly are allergic to dairy, you're not going to cheat. Or if you do, you're going to know it. Everything's going to go crazy. If you're allergic to gluten, it's miserable. So these true food allergies, which are much more common in atopic dermatitis, of course, those foods must be avoided. But these are for people that don't have those, or talking about other foods than the ones they're truly allergic to. They're saying, look, I think there could be some other food. Their studies really do show that it probably doesn't help much when we look at it under a microscope. What's interesting is, and I actually am a strong believer, I think that gluten and carbs in general, I think they're inflammatory. And I actually do think dairy for a lot of people is inflammatory. I think it's not bad. I don't want to demonize it, but I think that for many people with inflammation in their body, those are not great things to add. But that being said, when you look at these studies, even that should have shown some improvement, and it doesn't. So probably it's a smaller role that's harder to measure in the bigger picture. Next slide, please. One of my favorite studies was Dr. Hannafin, and he looked at patients who were 100% convinced that food was driving their eczema. So literally the food was the root cause, and they actually were admitted to the hospital for a while, and they were on a strict diet, and they had some good care. And what they found in that study was that over 80% of the patients at the end said, okay, we agree, it's not food. Now that we've really put it to the test, it's not. And these were patients who were pretty convinced. So I think it's interesting to talk about, and it can, unfortunately, can consume people's lives. They can be so convinced, and we've actually seen some kids get malnourished because they've said, well, maybe it's this, maybe it's this, maybe it's this, and then they're feeding the kids rocks and water, and the kids are actually starving. They're actually not getting enough protein or not getting enough food. And their eczema, of course, unfortunately, is still flaring. And so it's this terrible vicious cycle of, it must be something we're missing. We must be missing something and chasing the tail. Next slide, please. So what I often say to my own patients is, I wish foods were the cause. It'd be so easy. We'd be done. You wouldn't be here today. But we're not that lucky. And the lucky people that seem to find it was strawberries, it was gluten, it was dairy, it was whatever. They're the ones blogging about it and writing about it and torturing my patients. And I wish they would just go and live their lives happily and enjoy their lives instead of torturing my poor patients who keep searching. That being said, if there's a food we're worried about, and again, this is all beyond allergy testing, because allergy testing, we're going to do that. That's a given. That's guaranteed. But these are the ones that are more confusing. If there's one we're worried about, let's cut it. Let's totally cut it and check it out. But I want to be systematic. I want to be thorough, and I want to be honest, because one of the problems is that a lot of my patients will come back and they're working with a naturopath. I love that. I want to do that with them. But they'll say, okay, The naturopath is convinced it's X, it's this food. And we've been off it for 3 months. The eczema is not really much better. And I said, okay, what did they say? Are we going to move something else? No, they said that we got to wait longer. Now we got to wait 6 months or a year. And I'm like, but the kid's only 3 years old. I don't understand why we'd have to wait 2 years or something. It seems ridiculous at some point. And so I try to defend my patients there and say, I don't think that makes sense at that point, because it's sort of easy. If you don't know what's going on, you can just keep telling someone, keep waiting. I don't think that's the right answer either. But it's amazing. Many of my patients will say, I'm just going to keep trying. Or sometimes they'll come back and say, well, they think we cheated. Maybe they had a little slice of birthday cake, or maybe they had some soy sauce on the dish and that has gluten. And again, I'll say, gosh, I get it, but do you want to live this life? Like, if, let's say the answer is that we have to cut all these different things, is that what you want? For some patients, yes, the answer is yes. I do not want any medicines. I want to do it. But for other patients, it's like, gosh, no, I don't want to be freaking out the entire time about cheating or making a mistake or having one little tiny bit. So if it's not that, I want to know, right? It's not that I just want to keep doing this until I'm exhausted. So what I often say is, let's try to get things better. Let's use a regimen, get the skin healed. The other great thing is that when the skin's really flared up, it's really tough to tell what's actually triggering it, because the skin's a mess. So it almost seems like everything's triggering it. Nothing's triggering it. It's a big mess. If I can get things better, many times people say, wow, now we know it's tomatoes. All the other stuff, I was worried about oranges, I was worried about this, none of those flared up. But when we had tomatoes, holy guacamole, that flared it. And then we say, perfect, that's helpful. That actually let us see more clearly, because when things are a mess, it's like you can't tell what's what. Next slide, please. Now, leaky gut is a very closely associated concept. Next slide. And this is the idea that the small intestine in particular is actually leaking and permeable, but it's not supposed to be. And this is true. There's something to this. It is very, very new. People don't know a lot about this yet, but this has been shown that in patients with atopic dermatitis, the small intestine is leaky. You actually get leakage of larger proteins that aren't supposed to come out into the blood. They get in the blood. And this probably makes sense. We know the skin is inflamed and the gut is connected to the skin. It's one loop. If you trace your skin, it goes into your mouth and then it goes right down into your gut. That's the same epithelial surface. Next slide, please. They also showed in one study that if they gave patients probiotic, their leakiness got better. So that's really interesting. And the top graph here shows that as the atopic dermatitis was more severe, the leakiness of the gut was more severe. So again, showing there's a correlation between leakiness and severity of the skin. Again, which you'd expect. Skin and gut, very, very similar in many ways. They're connected deeply. If your skin is on fire, it's very likely that at least to some extent your gut is partially on fire. And it was nice to see that probiotics actually helped. Next slide, please. So a lot of my patients ask about this, and I'll say, this may be playing a role, but we don't know that much about it, and I can't access it in the same way. So let's eat healthy. Let's avoid the foods we're worried about. For sure, of course, we're avoiding our allergies, our true known allergies. And let's add probiotics. I have all my patients take probiotics pretty much across the board. I think they can't hurt and they can help a certain group of people. But I like to focus on the idea, though, of the other part that I can control, or at least help with a little bit more, and that's leaky skin, which we know is the critical cause of atopic dermatitis and really important to treat, because that's you against the world. And so if your skin is leaky, bacteria, allergens, irritants, they're all getting in, fueling the whole process. Next slide, please. So instead of leaky gut, or in addition to leaky gut, let's talk leaky skin and think about how can we help our skin. Of course, one of the key ways we can do that is by putting moisturizer on. And we know that that's very powerful. We also know that some of the things that will help our skin barrier, like sunflower seed oil, can really help seal that up. For the gut, we still need to learn a lot about it. Next slide, please. One of the interesting things that has now come full circle is the idea that the leaky skin is not secondary. You know, people will sometimes say, well, the gut comes first and then the skin is leaky. That's kind of how people thought it. You know, the gut is the problem and the skin is secondary. The food is driving the eczema. But in the last few years, we've actually started to turn this around. It seems like it's backwards. And here's the model. So they have these mice that are fine. They're healthy. They don't have eczema and they don't have food allergy. They're just fine. They shave them and they do tape stripping. They take some Scotch tape and they peel off parts of the skin layers. It's not too uncomfortable, just kind of irritates them to make them kind of like they have mild eczema. And then they take some egg protein, some ovalbumin, egg protein. They stick it on their skin. And after a while, they give the mice eggs to eat. These mice who are normally fine, they could eat egg, no problem. Now they eat the egg and they have anaphylaxis. They get terrible allergy. And the idea here is that they are able to transcutaneously sensitize these mice. They become allergic to the food through their skin. So skin first, gut second. And this is what we're starting to think is the truth for many patients, maybe not for all, but for many. And so if we can keep the skin under control, if we can seal up that leaky skin, we may be able to prevent this transcutaneous sensitization, both to foods, but to other things too, other environmental allergens. And so this has become a very, very hot topic. And it's been exciting to me because I've always felt that the food driving the eczema just didn't fit. It's not that it didn't feel right. It felt right in a way. It's like, God, it makes sense, but it never fit. A patient's going crazy on diet, trying more and more diets, and just not getting better. And then once they're better, they were able to eat the things they're worried about. This makes a lot of sense that if we get people better early and protect their skin, suddenly it fits. It's like, this actually explains what I'm seeing. Next slide, please. So a nice graph that summarizes part of this idea is that moisturization really helps. This is a beautiful slide showing the more patients use moisturizer, the less their eczema is. Next slide, please. Now, probiotics is something I also recommend to almost all of my patients. I love this concept that our bacteria is playing such a key role and that we know our patients with atopic dermatitis are imbalanced, both gut and skin. And there was this beautiful study that showed giving babies Lactobacillus GG decreased their development of atopic dermatitis in half. So it cut it in half, which is so exciting to me versus a control group. Next slide, please. This is all coming together now. This is some work from Dr. Kong, Heidi Kong at National Institutes for Health, where she's showing that this microbial diversity on the skin is really important for skin health, and that when that diversity starts to drop, staph bacteria goes up and then people flare. So that, again, we used to think when I started training, it was that staph bacteria is because the skin is damaged. But now we're starting to turn it around and say, oh my gosh, the staph is actually driving the damage. And so if we can recalibrate that skin, we might be able to help. Next slide, please. This got really interesting just a couple of years ago where they identified this toxin from staph bacteria called the delta toxin. And this toxin, if you put it on healthy skin, it actually makes an eczema. It actually makes this irritation and redness and breakdown. So really another thing that staph is doing, it's actively driving the disease. Next slide, please. So how do we put all of this stuff together? Next slide, please. I think we have to try to work in both worlds. We know that our conventional medicine, what your general doctor, your general dermatologist, pediatrician, allergist, what they're doing is supposed to be the best because ideally they're trying to take the best from everywhere. But there's no doubt that conventional medicine does not have all the answers, and that really only by opening ourselves up to these other methods, these other approaches and ideas, that's how we're going to get some real improvements and some real activity in going forward. And of course, in doing so, we remain humble, because one thing I've learned over and over and over again is that if ever I get too haughty, if ever I think I can fix this, I will meet a case that I can't. Or that is so harrowing that I realize my limitations pretty quickly. So I'm committed to being a lifelong learner so that I can figure out this disease and get people better. Thank you so much for your attention. That's our website, chicagoeczema.com. We have lots of handouts, lots of information. Of course, we're deeply connected to NIA, and we would hope you can experience and explore both sites.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leo, for an educational and informative presentation. We now move on to the question and answer portion of our event. A lot of great questions have come in already. We will take the next 2 minutes to receive additional questions for Dr. Leo. If you haven't already, please submit your questions now. While we can't get to every question, we've selected some of the most frequently asked from today's attendees to start with. While we wait for those questions to come in, we do want to encourage you to get involved with the National Eczema Association and help raise awareness about this disease. There are a lot of ways to get involved. You can become a NIA ambassador, sharing your eczema journey in writing or in person, working in grassroots advocacy, joining our online support group EczemaWise, and more. You can attend events. As I mentioned before, our last Leaders in Eczema Day-long Forum of 2017 will be held on October 1st at Mount Sinai in New York City. And save the date, our 3-day patient conference will be held in Chicago, June 22nd through 24th, 2018. No doubt Dr. Leo will be joining us there. And of course, you can donate. As a 501c3 nonprofit, our work relies on the support of our community. So now we will move on to some questions. Dr. Leo, one of the first questions that I'm going to ask that came in is specific to itch management. Of course, that is often one of the most challenging symptoms of this disease. Do you have any natural treatments that you can recommend for managing itch?
It's a great question. Itch is one of our most challenging areas, and we are always looking for new ideas and new treatments. A couple of things that I really like. I think using literally cold and cooling treatments can be so helpful. So it can be anything as simple as an ice pack, putting it to an area. Another trick that I like is to take the moisturizer and put it in the refrigerator. So when you put on a moisturizer when it's nice and cold like that, it really, really helps. It actually soothes the skin and has a very direct anti-itch effect. Another similar approach to this is to use, there are some mineral waters that are actually bottled for this purpose. And they actually, you can spritz them on the skin, and they have a fine mist of water, this mineral water, they're usually French mineral spring water, and you spray this on the skin, and it's incredibly soothing, it's cooling, and it really helps very quickly with the itch. So I like those as some alternatives to help very, very quickly.
Great. I know one of the big current new trends in natural health and fitness, as with many new things, is cryotherapy. How do you think that would affect someone living with eczema?
Absolutely. And, it's actually, cryotherapy has been studied, and it does seem to help. So that's, for those who don't know, they have these centers. They're basically a couple of rooms. In the rooms, you enter like a small room, and it sprays you with liquid nitrogen. It cools your whole skin down, and then you kind of go to the next room, and it cools you down more, and next room cools you down more. So it's this freezing, literally like a whole body freezing chamber effect. And it was originally kind of worked on for arthritis, where it actually does help, but people also use it for the skin. It's pretty safe, but there have been a number of cases of frostbite associated with it, unfortunately, because it is super cold, but there's no doubt it helps. It cools down itch and inflammation. It helps bring it down. The problem is it's just not a durable treatment. So you could do it, you maybe have some relief, and then you have to keep going. But I have definitely had patients who say it helps. And for certain patients, it could be something they could integrate in.
Great. You talked a lot about probiotics and that you recommend them to all your patients. Can you give a little more information about either give a recommendation or how to go about choosing a good probiotic? What's the earliest you should start giving, like a baby? Would it be through breast milk or given directly? And natural probiotics, just a little more on the probiotic section.
We wrote an article for The Advocate, the magazine for NIA, a couple months back, maybe a year ago, and maybe we could even like attach the reference on it, because we went through a bunch of different ones, which was kind of fun. The truth is, there's probably not great evidence for picking one over the other. Sometimes patients who see an alternative practitioner will say, well, my practitioner says they want us to use this one, or his or hers that they sell, and I think that's probably okay. But I can tell you this, a pretty inexpensive one that's over the counter, and I have no conflict with this company. I don't work with them. I don't know anybody there, but it's called Culturelle. And Culturelle is Lactobacillus GG. It's fairly inexpensive, it's widely available, and it's been studied a lot. So that's the one I usually recommend unless patients have their own that they prefer, in which case I say, okay, pick the one you like, because we just don't have enough evidence to know if one's better, but I've had good results with Culturelle, and I like that it's inexpensive and widely available. For babies, so you could start giving it to a baby really immediately in the immediate first week of life. And the way most people will do that is they'll use a liquid-based probiotic, and they'll put a drop on the breast or in the formula or milk to give to the baby that way. And the brand that I like there, and again, I have no conflict with them, but the one that I recommend is called BioGaia. BioGaia. And they're a European one. They've been around for a long time. There have been a number of studies with them. So I kind of feel that they're pretty safe in this context, but many people have their favorites, and many practitioners recommend their favorites. Some people kind of feel that my choices are too mainstream, and they like fancier ones that are on, that are refrigerated and stuff, but these are pretty good.
Great. What about food-based probiotics? All of the fermented foods. I know that's big in the probiotic world.
I think that they're really helpful. I think they're often part of a good diet, so I highly recommend them. But I don't know if you get enough probiotics from them to balance. So I'll often make that an and. I'll say yes, and let's eat those good fermented foods. They're so good for you. They're going to support the healthy bacteria too. But I'd love for patients to also take some probiotic to kind of ultra boost it, because I feel like if you're healthy, eating those fermented foods probably keeps you that way. But if we're in a state of imbalance and we're already suffering, then I want to do a little bit more than just eating well. Arguably, many cultures eat fermented foods normally. So it's like, in some ways, it's just going back to normal. We need super normal because we're already in a state of disease.
Sure. Can you talk a little bit about light therapy and vitamin D supplementation?
Absolutely. I love light therapy. It's something I do for a fair number of patients. It is a little bit clunky sometimes because people have to come in 2 to 3 times a week. You have to make sure you're at a place that knows what they're doing. But it is powerful. I would say probably 60 or 70% of my patients who are moderate to severe, they will see big improvement with light therapy, and it's quite safe. So it is almost an alternative treatment. And in a way, it's pretty mainstream, but it also is, it's wonderful. It's the healing power of light. It definitely does also boost vitamin D, which is fantastic and a very natural way to get it. Talk about the most natural way to get your vitamin D level up. It's through your skin, through the proper UV mediated pathway. So that's great. But again, it's just difficult. You have to make sure that the patients can come in and that it's convenient. I see a lot of patients from out of town, and then you're trying to coordinate with a local office. And I will tell you, unfortunately, sometimes it doesn't work well, and the patient has an issue and you're sort of not there. So if it works out, though, it's great.
Great. And what about vitamin E?
Vitamin E gets asked sometimes. It's interesting. We don't think it does much, and there have been a couple small studies showing it probably doesn't have much effect. It's one of those that probably can't hurt. It's a very nice vitamin. Many people think of it as being important for skin healing, but it probably doesn't do anything too much for the skin, and so it's not something I'll recommend. But if somebody's on it and says it's helpful, by all means, it certainly won't hurt.
Great. You mentioned coconut oil and some great research there. There are, as you mentioned, the virgin coconut oil or the cold pressed, and then there's fractionated coconut oil that doesn't seem to have the same aroma of the other. Would you recommend one over the other?
Ooh, it's a good question. I think that in theory, the one we want is fractionated. I think we want no smell and no protein. The reason is because if there are a lot of proteins, if it smells really coconutty, it's not bad, and maybe it even has some extra good stuff, but I think there's a much higher risk of becoming allergic to it or being allergic to it. The one that's fractionated, they filtered out the protein, pick the part that has no protein. That's probably what we're talking about when we're looking at this. But you're right, I have opened up some, and it's like, wow, there's like coconut bits in here. So that's a little bit different. It may still work, it may still be helpful, but I might be just a touch more concerned about allergy.
Great. we certainly talk a lot about bleach bath as a tool, and that's I don't know if we'd call it natural, but sort of. Certainly not medication that you're taking. Um, can you talk a little bit about a bleach bath versus, I'm sure you've heard of the CLN body wash?
Sure. Yeah. So I agree. I think bleach baths are kind of they're on that line, right? They're sort of mainstream, sort of alterna. I think they're really powerful. Most people really do see some improvement. And what I love about bleach baths is that they probably don't damage the bacteria. So when we first started them, we all thought, oh, these are antibacterial. And I even had some patients say, well, gosh, are we going to be damaging the good guys? But there have been a few studies, actually 3 in the last couple of years, that suggest that not only does it not mess up our healthy bacteria, it doesn't even kill the bad guys. And that probably the way that it's working is more of an anti-inflammatory pathway, which is kind of amazing. So that brings us to the clean wash, which is a soap that's marketed as sort of being like bleach in a bottle. And I would say, it's a fine product. It really is. It's a fine product. My sense is that it's very expensive for what you're getting, and that you're not really getting bleach in the same way. It has a very tiny, tiny bit of sodium hypochlorite in there, and that it's much cheaper and much more controllable to just do a little tiny splash of bleach in the bathtub. A quarter cup to a half cup in a tub really does a great job for a fraction of the price. The clean's fairly expensive. But if there's a particular situation where somebody feels like they can't do a bleach bath or can't put it in a bottle and do a spritz before a shower, which is another thing that we'll do for some patients, we'll have them make it in a little spray bottle, spray it on, let it sit for a few minutes, and then wash it off in the shower if they don't have access to a bath. If even that's too cumbersome, then yes, I think the clean wash is a very reasonable thing to try.
Great. Circling back to leaky gut, we've talked about probiotics and even some of the fermented foods that can be beneficial. What about the bone broth?
Yes. So there's a couple of different diets, like there's the GAPS diet, for example, and some of the diets really push some of these elemental type treatments, foods like bone broth, marrow, things like that. I think they're good for us. I think they really are. I think they may well have an effect in feeding the good bacteria. I do. I don't know if they make a big enough difference to sort of be worth recommending broadly, but I've had patients who've seen some improvement. And I think that, I like people eating healthy. I don't love tons of animal products. I actually, I love to see more of a plant-based diet when we can, but I'd prefer just more paleo if we can't do that. So the Paleolithic, kind of like how would our ancestors have eaten? I think it's hard to argue with that, to eat non-processed foods, to eat simple things, to eat rich things. I think that's okay, and mostly good.
Great. Can you talk a little about Ayurvedic medicine and homeopathy?
Sure. So I'm working with some really neat folks, one of whom is at University of California, Davis, who knows a lot about Ayurvedic medicine. And there's some interesting pieces to it. It's a big system and it's really complex. I know much more about traditional Chinese medicine than Ayurvedic, but many of the treatments will sort of spill out. So I think the concept of turmeric, curcumin, being really anti-inflammatory has come a lot from Ayurvedic medicine, both topically and orally. So that's been really exciting. And I think there's a lot there. Ayurvedic medicine also has a lot of discussion about what kind of diet is right for your type. So there's a lot of this concept of, where do you fit and what would be best for you? And it'd be so neat to study that more. Can we help understand better subtypes of eczema? Can we help find better things that are going to work for certain people? Now, homeopathic medicine is such a compelling idea. It's like this wonderful sticky concept that like cures like. And it all came about with the idea that maybe, you could take a plant. So if you're having belly pain, you could take a plant that causes belly pain and feed it to the person, and then it would cancel out the belly pain. That's kind of the basic concept of homeopathy. And it's really compelling. But when you look at the actual studies, it probably doesn't work on the broad scale. And there are some anecdotal reports, of course. Many people swear by it. Some countries like Germany, up until very recently, it's actually part of the national medicine. Like they actually will pay for homeopathic treatments. So there's something to it. I don't exactly know what it is, but and it is very compelling, but it doesn't seem to actually work, especially the way it's done in modern times. And part of it's that we now don't use the full strength plant or mineral or element. But what they do now is they dilute it, highly dilute it. And that's been something that was kind of formed in the latter day. When it first was conceived, it was really like cures like, and then it became this idea that as you dilute them, you can actually get them more powerful. So they do this dilution. And the problem is they're so diluted that there's nothing in there. And so that's been really hard for a lot of mainstream scientists, because it's this idea that, well, if the dilution makes them stronger, then our tap water is going to kill us, right? Because the tap water is so diluted, everything in the universe has been through the tap water. And so it ends up being a little bit of silliness. So I'd say the jury is still out for me, but many, many scientists feel that there's just good evidence that it doesn't help. And I try to steer my patients away, because I think you can spend a lot of time and energy there, but we can do better things with power of nature, power of traditional Chinese medicine, power of elements, the cold treatments, the light treatments. There are other things we can do that I think we can show a reliable response.
Great. Well, we are just about out of time here, but let's finish with the big question that I know you get all the time, and that is just an alternative angle on the perceived and real dangers of topical steroids. There's always concern why so many doctors only go to the topical steroids and don't want to talk about a lot of these more natural treatments. Can you talk a little bit about why you think doctors maybe do that, and how patients can address it and feel a little more secure in their decision-making process?
Absolutely. I think, we're trained to use them because that's what we know works for most people. But then we're not trained beyond that, sort of like just use it and good luck. I think we really need, and of course, Nia is working really hard to create a whole curriculum for people that take care of patients with eczema to try to teach better about how to properly use them. The good news and the bad news is, and it's really both, it's the good and the bad of it, is that they really work great. They get things under control reliably for most patients. The bad thing is that they're not a long-term solution. You can't just keep people on steroids all the time. It's terrible for your skin, from the things we know about, well, like the skin thinning, the stretch marks, to the systemic things. If you're putting a ton of steroid on, you can actually have systemic absorption, and to topical steroid withdrawal, which is a terrible, terrible, terrible thing. And I have a number of patients with this withdrawal syndrome that's just crummy. So we do not want that. But I think there's also a lack of teaching about what to do next. And so really, for me, the secret of the whole thing, and why to my knowledge, I don't think I've caused much or any, hopefully, TSW. And I think the secret is because I do plans. I do a treatment plan. I say we're going to use the steroid for a brief burst. And I think it can be used very safely that way. It can cool the inflammation down, but then we got to stop. It's not a long-term solution. It's something to help jump on it and get things better. And then we put that away. Now we need to have a plan, non-steroids, to help keep things clear. And we can go back to them from time to time. But the key question I'm asking, and I want everyone to ask at that 1 month or 2 month follow-up, whenever they come back, and it shouldn't be a 6 month follow-up, right? When we start, we got to see people pretty quickly. We need to say, okay, how often are you needing a steroid? How often are you flaring? And if the patient says to me, gosh, I used it 3 weeks out of the month, I say, no way, we can't do this. We got to change. We have to stop. We can't let this keep going. Or even if they say, I use it for 5 days in a row, I get only 2 days off, and then I'm back on for 5. I say, no, it's not going to happen. So if a patient says, you know what, it's been great. I used it for 3 days. I got things under control. Then I've been using my moisturizer, my other stuff, my non-steroidals. I've been doing great. I had a little flare up last week. I used it for 2 or 3 days again, and I've been great. I say, we're perfect. You are safe. You are going to be great. This is not problematic. But we really have to ask those questions. And we need to have good ideas of what to do in that meantime. And that's where I love the integrative approach, because sometimes people say, well, what else is there besides steroids? Well, this is where we can use things like topical B12. This is where we can use things like phototherapy, cryotherapy. We can use our different oils. Some of those things can be enough, especially for milder patients. They should never have steroid overuse. Now, for the more moderate and severe, then sometimes we just have to get more aggressive. We have to say, look, topicals are not helping you, or we're using them too much. They're being abused, and they're going to hurt your skin. We need to go to the next level. And that's why we're really lucky. We have some new powerful systemic treatments. So I might say, hey, we're going to do light therapy. Hey, we're going to try maybe one of the new biologic agents, one of the injectables.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for helping us understand how to separate fact from fiction with complementary and alternative medicine.
Thank you for having me.
You can learn more about all of these opportunities that you've heard about tonight and learn more about Dr. Leo, as well as many other eczema resources on our website at nationaleczema.org. On behalf of the National Eczema Association, thank you all for attending our complementary and alternative medicine webinar. Have a wonderful night.